The two stories from today's reading are probably familiar to a lot of us. The feeding of the 5,000, the calming of the storm. But what I had not recognized until recently was how intentionally the two stories are connected. Quick summary. There's a huge crowd and they're hungry. And Jesus says to his disciples, "You give them something to eat." The disciples point out the impossibility of this. Jesus, sigh, shows them how it's done. "How many loaves do you have?" 5. "Okay, organize the people into smaller groups." Done. "Okay, pray. Break the loaves. Share." And they ate, and all were filled, with lots left over. Immediately, Mark tells us, immediately Jesus sends his disciples out on a boat to the sea. A storm kicks up. The disciples are straining at the oars, trying to row to safety. Jesus walks out on the sea. The disciples are terrified when they see him. Jesus says, "It's only me, don't be scared." He gets in the boat, the winds cease, and then comes this verse that we're going to focus on today. "They were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves." What, you may ask, do the loaves have to do with a storm at sea and the disciples' terror? As I mentioned earlier, Walter Brueggemann, a very brilliant biblical theologian, died earlier this month. When I was pastor here many years ago, I had the opportunity to study with Brueggemann, and many of us in the congregation at that time read and sometimes even heard from him and studied together, and we learned an incredible amount of new ways of understanding our faith. I have been rereading a lot of Brueggemann, actually since somewhere around January 20th, because I kind of needed it, and more intently since his death. And I came across a sentence about this verse. Brueggemann writes, "They did not understand that the bread of life is thrown into the face of the storm of death, and the bread will win. The bread will win every time." This line stopped me cold, and it's haunted me ever since. And one reason is because, to be honest, I don't know if I believe it. In my head, the storms of death, the forces of evil seem pretty horribly strong right now. But the second reason the line has haunted me is because I know in my guts that it is true. That Brueggemann is naming a fundamental gospel truth, whether I believe it or not. There have been a few times when I have felt called to preach beyond my own experience, beyond my own perceptions, beyond my limited vision, because it's limited. We're all limited, right? And the good news of the gospel calls us beyond our limits to another kind of truth. That's what Leaf said via Brueggemann in the opening prayer. So I'm going with that today. In spite of, and maybe even especially because of the events of last night, I think it's important that we search for this gospel truth even if we do not understand the loaves. The passage tells us that the crowd was hungry. Hunger, we understand. The World Food Program tells us that 1.9 million people are living in the grips of catastrophic hunger, particularly in Gaza, Sudan, and pockets of Haiti and Mali. There are people in our own communities who also sometimes go to bed at night hungry. Some of them are children. We know hunger is real. And there's also a different sort of hunger that probably many of us experience. It's the hunger for wisdom, the hunger for healing, the hunger for just a few days of calm, the hunger for hope. When you think about it, that's why the crowd followed Jesus. They followed him because they were hungry for wisdom and hope and meaning. And that's what brings lots of us here today. The disciples were caught in a storm. Storms we also understand. And many of us feel right now we are caught in a nightmarish, chaotic storm in our country and in our world. And the winds are going against us. And it seems almost impossible that we can row to anything close to justice or human kindness or sanity or hope. And then the storms in our personal life continue to toss us about. Whether it is broken relationships or worry about illness or loss of job or Medicare or death of loved ones, those storms continue too. Oh, the text narrates us very well. We are undernourished and we are afraid. We are lost and we focus a whole lot of our time on anxiety-filled storm management, right? I love that phrase because it totally describes my life right now. Anxiety-filled storm management, and we do not understand about the loaves. Interestingly, Mark, in case we didn't get it the first time, Mark repeats the whole point a little later. 2 chapters later, Marjorie read from Mark 6. In Mark 8, he tells 2 very similar stories. He tells the story of the feeding of the 4,000, and it has the same format. Hungry crowd, count the loaves, organize the people into smaller groups, pray, break bread, share, more than enough for everybody to eat. And then Mark says, immediately after that, they hop into a boat and go out to sea. The one difference is this time Jesus is in the boat with the disciples, and at the end of that scene, Jesus says in exasperation, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand about the loaves?" I don't know if it's reassuring or alarming that we find ourselves in the same boat as the disciples right now. They and we do not understand about the loaves. Okay, first let me assure you this is not a sermon, or warn you, this is not a sermon that all is well and all is going to end well. Because we know that's not true. All is not well and we don't know how it's going to end. Jesus knows that, and so do we. This is not a talk on positivity. But what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples and what the gospel today calls us to embrace is a way to face all of this, a way to be in the storm, following Jesus' instructions and aligning ourselves with the gospel truth that the bread will win, sometimes in small and sometimes big ways. But the bread will win along the way. You'll notice that when the disciples bring the problem to Jesus, the first thing he said is, "You feed them." Jesus believes we can do this, okay? So we can. First of all, we can be kind. We can be kind to one another, to ourselves, to strangers, offering intentional words of affirmation, some extra patience, pausing to look each other in the eye and see each other as human beings, especially when the winds are chaotic. Now, society sometimes tells us, if not explicitly, it feels that way, that we don't have time for all of that. We're too busy, we have other things to do. And my friends, that is a lie. We are here to be kind. That is why we were put on this earth. And every time we are kind, in that moment, the bread wins. We can be intentional about community. I think that's why Jesus forms the crowd into smaller groups. You can't have community with 4,000 or 5,000 people. But Jesus intentionally, in every account, tells the disciples to get people into smaller groups. Community right now is not a luxury, my friends. It is a necessity. And yes, it takes work to be in community, and it can be hard to learn to share, but it is so, so worth it. Because in community is how the bread wins. We can pray. This is doing whatever feeds our souls and reminds us that we are not alone. Beauty, nature, music, silence. Prayer is how we transcend our frightened, limited, individualistic selves in a way that we connect to something more, to something sacred. And then we can practice and share joy. Whatever brings you joy, laughter, friends, beauty, silliness even. Sharing joy is a crucial part of sharing the bread and keeping it abundant. Sharing joy and joy itself, again, in these times is no longer a luxury. It is a necessity. Please remember that. I actually like to think that when the disciples were passing out the bread, they told knock jokes as they went. And when we align ourselves with the power of the bread, when we break and bless and share the bread, as we do every Sunday around this table, we are practicing ourselves becoming the bread, giving our lives as embodiments of the generosity and a power beyond our own understanding. And then we can get into the boat together. We can go out to sea together. We can say to one another, do not be afraid. We are not alone. And when we do that in the storm together, the bread wins. So this is not about waiting for some sane court decision or for Congress to get a backbone or for the end of the warring madness in the Middle East and other places that our nation supports and participates in. Yes, we should work and pray for all of that, but we don't wait for that for the bread to win. This is also not about only hoping for encouraging medical news or that we make it through this summer, another summer without horrific wildfires, or that we can find some security in our jobs or our medical care. Yes, we should work and pray for all of that, but we don't wait for that. The bread wins in who we are and what we do and how we navigate now, in the moment, every day, in the storm. Earlier this week, I listened to the reflections of members of the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. As some of you probably know, last Tuesday marked 10 years since a young white man walked into that church with the stated intention of starting a race war. He walked into a Bible study, he was warmly welcomed, and then he opened fire and killed 9 people. One of the members of that church acknowledged the horror of what had happened and then asserted that the killer's plan had backfired because he did not start a race war. In the city of Charleston, so full of so much painful history, this member of the church said, "It brought us closer together." In the midst of the storm of death, the Black community there refused to hate, and some even took the courageous stance to forgive, and the bread won. The pastor of the church, Reverend Eric Manning, emphasized that the trauma of those events continued within the church today. He said, "We are still a church experiencing trauma." And then he moves on to say, "But we have a motto, and our motto is to be light in the pathway of darkness." And we embrace that motto still. Pastor Manning said, "God brought us through 400 years of slavery, decades of Jim Crow, decades of racism, and now we need to be sure that our message is one of hope and resilience and restoration." Pastor Manning said, "Hate won't win. Love is more powerful than hate." So some of Jesus' disciples, a long time ago and now, and sometimes including me and maybe you, still do not understand about the loaves. But I am absolutely certain that the members and community of Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina, and that Pastor Manning, they do understand, that they know what Brueggemann claimed, that the bread of life is thrown into the face of the storm of death, and the bread will win. The bread will win every time. May we learn from them. Amen.